Welcome everyone to our Moxy webinar on using Moxy for indoor cycling, presented by Curtis Scrugham from Breakaway Endurance Coaching. The format for the webinar is that Curtis is going to present for about 15 minutes, then we'll have a short question break. Then Curtis will finish up the second half of the presentation and we'll have a longer Q&A break at the end. This is similar to the format that we've done in the past. We'll finish up at about 45 minutes past the hour, so you can plan on that. If there's any extra questions, we'll post them with the recording on our forum, and Curtis will follow up with answering those questions on the forum. So if you have questions, please type them into the questions panel on the right side of your screen, and you can type them in anytime, and we'll take those during our different question periods. So Curtis has an introduction slide for himself, so I'm going to let him take care of that and just turn things over to him. So take it away, Curtis.
All right, I've got it. So, like Roger said, we're all here to learn about integrating Moxy into an indoor cycling studio, which I've done this past year. And for a little intro about myself, a big intro about myself. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. I do have a MS in exercise physiology, power-based training certified. I got that in person with Hunter Allen. I'm working on a second master's degree in the sports sciences, in which I do plan on integrating the Moxy and looking at the different models of bioenergetics. And like Roger said, I'm the owner-operator of Breakaway Endurance Coaching and the Powerhouse CompuTrainer Studio. I do have my email down at the bottom. You know, Roger said that I will be on the forum to answer questions, but you can also grab that email and send me questions if you have any that you want me to answer. Okay, so the way I'm going to attack this is we're going to first look at, real briefly, the studio setup I have and the software I use. That'll take just a couple of minutes. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the process I went through of actually using the Moxy in the studio. After that, I'll take a look at some of the challenges I did face and still do kind of face a little bit. There's some parts of it that keep you pretty busy at certain times of the workouts. So we'll talk about those, and then, like you said, we'll open things up for questions. Okay, so like I mentioned, I've got a CompuTrainer studio. The next slide here is going to be my layout. I've got a 10 studios set up. Each yellow block is a CompuTrainer station. The red boxes are my video projectors pointing to the video screens in front of my riders. I've got up here at the top like an L shape. That's my little computer console where I control everything from. And right here in the middle is a W. That's for the WASP. I use the WASP AMP Plus receiver from North Pole Engineering to collect all of the sensor data. And then next up here I have a slide, just a picture of my WASP hanging from the ceiling from its high-speed Ethernet cord as we've got a workout in progress. So that's just my basic setup in a nutshell. And the software I use to run the entire studio is Perf Pro Studio, if you're familiar with that. If you're not, it's an awesome piece of software, I think. So I've been using it for 3 years. Anytime I've had a problem, I just shoot the developer Drew Hartman an email, and he's usually on top of it. But the big thing is he's seamlessly integrated being able to use the Moxy in with the workouts. And actually, before I go on, I'm just going to take a second and explain why I decided to use the Moxy for this. Is with the CompuTrainer, I use all my workouts based off % of FTP. And the problem I ran into is once you start getting into efforts above FTP, like 120 or 130%, you can have some people where that's a good, strong, solid effort. I can say 120 for a minute, 120% for a minute, and they can knock that out, and some people are dying at the end. So it's really not the best interval for some people, but it was great for others. So the challenge was, how do I create workouts where I'm working everyone where they need to be working above FTP when I'm doing above FTP workouts. Okay, so that's why I did go over and start using Moxy. So now we're going to talk about the process of how I integrated the Moxy from day one. And of course I start out like most people do with an FTP test. And the reason we do that for the Moxy is to establish a reference power for the Moxy 5-minute step test, which we'll talk about in just a second. Now, the FTP test, if you're familiar with it, you don't do that as a percent FTP workout. You do it as percent grade. You set a percent grade. I think they do it at 0.25%, and the rider simply works against that resistance for their workout or for their test. And that's the same way that I built the Moxy workouts. And that's really important to have that correct, and we'll talk about why in just a second. Okay, and here's just a picture of the Perf Pro Studio with that profile down at the bottom of a flat 0.5% or 0.25% grade workout. Now, as I warm them up when I'm doing the interval workouts, I use percent grade. So if you have a 3% grade and you have a 125-pound person versus a 200-pound person, the 200-pound person is going to have a much more resistance on the bike than the 125-pound person. So it's really critical to have that weight correct. Okay, so once we've established their FTP, we do the Moxy 5-minute step test. Now, the 5-minute step test has multiple applications. You can do different things with it. But for the purpose of running the Moxy in the studio, the reason I do it is to figure out how low of each person's saturated muscle oxygenation, or SMO2, can go. That's important. And I use the cutoff of 30%, and Roger, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that one, but I assign the interval type based on how low their SMO2 can go. If it can't go below 30, I consider them having a utilization limitation, and then I'll assign them the 30-second maximum efforts. And if they do go below 30, then I assign the 5-minute submax efforts, and we'll see some pictures and slides of those in action here in just a few minutes. But it's important to do that 5-minute step test. I've got a couple slides here that show the step test, how I've got it set up in Perf Pro Studio. You can see the, okay, I'm a slide behind. Let me jump one more. There we go. Okay, so again, this is percent FTP. So we start off at 41% for 5 minutes, and 57, 73, 89, 105. At 105, they're usually working pretty hard. Most people complete the 105 at 5 minutes, not a problem. The next step up on the 5-step interval test is 120%, and most people can get through that. Some quite can't make it, and then usually we have some people who can get to 137, but I've had no one complete 137 at 5 minutes because you're up in the anaerobic capacity range, and technically no one should be able to do 5 minutes up there. If so, their FTP number is probably just a little bit wrong. Okay, so given that, it takes roughly 20 to 25 minutes to complete this part of the test. And then I'm going to spend the next 30 minutes with them. They came in for an hour workout, 30 minutes showing them how to do the intervals and practicing the intervals. And that's where the first challenge really kicks in, because you've got to get around the room and explain to everyone what they need to do. Okay, so I do practice intervals, like I said, and I set it up. They've got 30 minutes, and like I mentioned with the FTP test, we now switch over to, or from a percent FTP based workout to a percent grade workout. With percent grade, like I mentioned earlier, it's really important to have their weight correct. I accidentally didn't do this one time. I had a 25-pound female that could put out 200 watts, but her weight was set at like 175, and she was dying at the warm-up, and we couldn't figure out why. It took me a time or two to realize that her weight was set incorrectly. So that's a really important little note to make. Okay, so that's just a screenshot. I normally set the percent grade at 0.5%. It's not critical. They can raise it or lower it as they see fit. But now, like I said, is the challenge of making it around the room to however many stations you have and explaining what type of interval they need to do. Usually I just start at one end of the room, tell everyone to soft pedal until I get to them, and then I explain the intervals. The 30-second maximal intervals everyone grasps very quickly. It's the 5-minute submax intervals that people have difficulty with. And I've got some good slides of those in progress here in just a moment. So I've done my FTP test, then I bring them in another time. We do the 5-minute step test, and then we have roughly 30 minutes of practicing their intervals. Okay, and now it's time to bring them in for the interval workout. Okay, now here's how I set up the Moxy interval workout. If you look at the bottom of the screen, we've got the elevation profile, but it's not elevation in this case. Well, actually in this case it's percent grade, so it is. We start out with 0. I warm them up for just about 10 minutes, take them up to 2% grade, have them stay at 2% grade for a couple minutes, spend a minute at 3% just to get the blood going very well. Bring it back down to 2 for a minute. And then the rest of the workout is going to be at 0.5%, which is that long, flat area. So that leaves them approximately 40 minutes to do intervals, because I'm going to leave 5 minutes at the end for a cool down. And they can get approximately 5 intervals or interval sets in during that time. So that's what they can expect when they show up and start their Moxy interval workout. Okay, so next up now we actually have some screenshots of the different types of intervals in action. Okay, so now we've got 4 different riders on the station, and we have 4 different graphs. We actually have a couple picture-perfect examples of some of these intervals that we're going to look at. So if you're looking at the 4 graphs, if you look at the bottom left, that is someone there for the first, looks like almost 20 minutes, did their warm-up, and then they started doing the 30-second max efforts. They do 30-second max until their SMO2 bottoms out, then they recover until it peaks out. Then they do the next 30-second interval, and they did 5 repeats in that case. It looks like they're on the recovery, just starting the recovery on that graph. Now, if you look directly over at the one on the bottom right, labeled Aaron, that's a picture-perfect 5-minute interval. It's a submax, and the purpose of that interval is for them to get their SMO2 down to its lowest point in 5 minutes. Now, here's the tricky part. Some people think, okay, I start out easy, my SMO2 doesn't drop, and I progressively get harder and harder. And that's not the purpose and the way to do those intervals. And that's why we do that practice after the 5-minute step test. What they're supposed to be doing is picking a power level, which I found out is usually between 90 and 100% FTP. Hold that steady for 5 minutes. And then your SMO2 initially drops significantly at the beginning because of compression outflow, and just all of a sudden you're now active and using oxygen. And then it slowly drops the rest of the time until it hits bottom. Then they can recover. So that's just a picture-perfect example. One thing I found out that did help is I took pictures of these on my phone and went around the room and showed them to people. Okay, this is ideally what we want your graph to look like. And that helped me explain to them what they were doing. Okay, if you look at the top 2 graphs, unfortunately not everyone's graph is going to look picture-perfect no matter how hard they try. If you look at the upper right, you have Alan. He's doing the same 5-minute submax intervals that Aaron is doing. He's just having a little rougher time figuring out exactly how to do them. And if you look over at the top left, we have Jenny, who about the 20-minute mark, that's her trying to do her first 5-minute submax interval. So it looks a little rough, and then she took a break, and I can't quite tell what she's doing after that in this particular shot. Okay, so there's just a couple of examples of those in progress, those different types of intervals. Here's just another screenshot of some perfect 30-second maximal efforts. I start out having them do 5 in a row and then take a break and do another 5 to see how that works for them, and then progress from there if they can, to do an increasing number of intervals, try to work up to say 10. And again, they can probably get about 5 sets of these in during a 1-hour workout, considering a warm-up and cool down. Okay, next screenshot we've got.
Hey Curtis. I'm gonna break in here. We're about halfway through our time.
Okay.
We've got a couple of questions that have come in, so if you could take these, and then if anyone has additional questions, you can type them in, and we'll take them at the end. The first one here: does the CompuTrainer automatically control the resistance on the step test, or is the rider just trying to maintain it?
Okay, on the step test, that's percent FTP based, so the CompuTrainer is controlling the resistance on that one.
Okay, and then the next question is kind of related. It says, what do you mean with grade, like 2% grade?
Okay, just like a hill. You're going up a hill, you're perfectly flat, you're 0% grade. If you start to go up a little bit, you go 1% grade, and it's just the steepness of the hill, or the resistance that the CompuTrainer is going to give them. If that made sense.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you, Roger?
Yeah, so I mean, the way I think of it is the one case is constant power that the CompuTrainer adjusts to keep the power the same, and then in the other way it adjusts to keep the resistance the same. So if you try and go faster, okay, it's higher power. Is that how you think of it? Okay.
Yeah, that works. And just to kind of tack onto that, like we said during the step test, the CompuTrainer, if you speed up, it's going to back the power off to maintain the same power. Right. Or it's going to back the resistance off to maintain the same power, versus an FTP test or percent grade test or workout where the rider is free to change gears just like he's riding on the road to get the right cadence against the resistance that the CompuTrainer is providing.
Okay, we got one more here, actually two more. Does the Perf Pro Studio save SMO2 data to the file for later viewing?
Let's see, it saves it. I'm trying to remember. Yes, it does.
Yep. That's been my experience, and it saves it to the fit file if you want to export it as well. And then the other part of that question is, does the Perf Pro Studio support more than one Moxy sensor?
Yes, I have. I have a studio of 10. I have them all working at the same time with the Moxy monitor. I've rigged it to where I've had 3 monitors on one person before. I simply, let me back up a couple slides. Like, here's Jenny. I would have her right quad sensor on her. Then in the second position, instead of mark, I would say deltoid, and I would put a sensor there so I could see both sensors at the same time and both graphs at the same time. And then I would put, say, her left quad over here and see her data so I could see all 3 graphs at the same time. Then it just gets a little tricky if you want to download those and integrate them onto one graph. That takes a little effort, but it's doable. Yeah, that's been my experience too. I've been talking with Drew about that issue, and I've asked him if he could make it so that we could put multiple sensors on one rider. So it's on his feature request list. So we'll see if he that way they would all be in the same fit file. Right. So, okay, we've got a few more questions. I think we'll push those off to the end. And if you want to jump back into the presentation where we left off, and then take about 15 more minutes, and then we'll follow up with more questions at the end. Okay, great. We're not terribly far from the end, so that'll work out well. Okay. So here again was just an example of some of the 30-second maximal efforts, recovering and then repeating those, and then taking a break and doing another set. Okay, now something else you can do. If we notice, I'm going to go back a couple slides to right here. The scale is set, the x-axis, for the entire 1-hour workout. So I can see this is just a 5-minute interval right here. You can change that, and this is 5 minutes from here to here. Actually here. Mark got overzealous and did like a 6+ minute interval. So I can zoom in, if you will, on the intervals and see what they're looking like. The top 2 here are 5-minute intervals. They did the 5-minute interval, they recovered, and as soon as they got recovered and started to level off, they started another 5-minute interval. Down here, this is a zoom in of Jenny's 30-second maximal efforts, 30-second max, recover, 30 seconds max, recover, and then she took like a 5-minute break and then resumed her intervals from there. Okay, I think I've got one more slide before we talk about challenges. And here is just a picture-perfect example. One of the often question people have is, when do I stop doing my intervals? And here's a perfect example. Okay, so Jenny, she was Super Troopers. She actually did 10 intervals in a row, and then I told her, okay, you don't have to do that many. Take a break. And then she took a break, jumped back in, and if you notice, she could not get her SMO2 as low as it was during her first 10. Okay, and that's a sign that, okay, you're starting to peter out, and maybe it's a good time to call it. And then you notice she took a break and then tried another set of 5, and her SMO2 was even higher. She couldn't get it down as low as it was before. So I just wanted to throw that slide in as a picture-perfect example of, okay, you can stop doing intervals now for the day because you're done. Let's see. So that leads me to the different challenges that I faced doing this and still face to some extent. The first one, like I've already talked about, is explaining what's going on to everyone. Because all of a sudden you stick the sensor on and you throw these graphs up there, they're asking, okay, what's the green line, what's the red line, what does it mean when it's doing this, and the red line is doing that, and why does mine not look the same as his next to me? So for the first couple times in this, you integrate the Moxy into your studio, you're going to spend a lot of time just going around answering questions, pretty much the entire time, actually. So the next challenge I faced was getting each person to understand what they need to do based off that information. Now, like I mentioned, we started off doing the 5-minute step test, and then we did a 30-second practice session. And here's the way I handled that. I pretty much told everyone, okay, everybody soft pedal until I get to you. And I started with the first 2 guys that I could stand in between and explain to. Okay, you need to do your 30 seconds. Maximal efforts, or you need to do this 5-minute interval, and here's how it looks. Then I tell them, just go give it a shot. I'll be back around and see how well you did, and then I just work my way around the room. If there's only one of you and you have a 10 or 20 studio setup, you're going to be very busy. So that's a definite challenge until they understand what's going on. That takes a couple sessions to get to that point. The next challenge I ran into was assigning monitors to each rider before the workout. I've got 10 stations, the workout's over, I've got 10 people leaving, I've got to collect monitors off of them, wipe them down with a Clorox wipe, get the little sticky attachments on for the next person, get them on the next person, and then appropriately assign that monitor to that person before the workout. Now that's critical. To make sure the right person has the right monitor assigned to them. It's just like if they had the wrong heart rate assigned to them and they're working as hard as they can and the guy next to them soft pedaling and their heart rate's only 120 and the other guy's is 180 because they were switched. It's going to just totally blow the workout for them. And I did have this happen one time, and luckily it was with a husband and wife, Mark and Jenny, like we mentioned earlier, and they thought it was pretty funny, actually, in the end, just because of what they were trying to do. So that's challenging from a logistics standpoint of just getting it done quickly and correctly. And the last main challenge I had at the very beginning was lighting. This took me a couple times as well. I did some Moxy tests actually in my home office where I had some flood halogen lights in that part of the room, and the sensor data was just completely wacky. It made no sense whatsoever, and I couldn't figure out why. It worked fine at my studio but didn't work here, and then I realized I don't have light sensors or light shields. It's probably the light, so I switched over to halogen lighting, and I've had no problem since. So that's something you do need to be aware of, is what lighting you have where you're at. If you can't change your lighting, then you'll probably need to get the light shields. Okay, so those were the main challenges I came across, and a couple of them I still work with a little bit. And I think now it's time to open it up to more questions.
Okay, thanks so much. Just to clarify, which was it, the fluorescent lighting or the halogen lighting that worked better?
The fluorescent lighting works great. I have no problems.
Okay, yep, that's what I expected. Okay. Okay, then we got one question here. Do you consistently get clear results from the 5-minute step test?
Okay, so from the 5-minute step test, I've only do it once, and that's at the beginning to figure out how low their SMO2 goes, so we know what type of workout to assign them. And then, like I mentioned, there are other purposes you can use the 5-minute step test for, such as assigning training level zones and things like that. And I'm not using it for that reason. So I can't say I get consistent results from it because I use it only once at the beginning.
Okay. Okay. How, is it clear? What you use that to distinguish between whether they should be doing the 5-minute intervals or the 30-second intervals? Is it generally pretty clear which way somebody has to go?
Most of the time, yes. Occasionally, you have some people who are right there at the threshold of around 30%.
Okay.
And then I just go from how well I know the athlete. I pick what type of interval I think they should be doing.
Okay. We've got some comments here. These were from Richard Wharton back when we were talking about the Perf Pro Studio. He commented, I think we've answered that one. The Perf Pro does save as a fit file. And then he says this will happen in the next 30 to 45 days. I think that was with regard to supporting multiple sensors per Moxy.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Richard, in the question pane there. And then one other question here: what place are users placing the monitor on? What sensor location?
Okay. I always use the vastus lateralis, the VL, and pick a leg right or left. It doesn't really matter. It depends on if they're already on their bike, which one's easier for me to access.
Okay. Do you always use the same side?
If I'm doing tests with multiple sensors, I always set it up the same way. But in the case where I'm just putting one sensor on them, I just pick a side that's, like I said, that's most convenient to reach.
Okay. Okay, and then does one computer run both displays?
Yes. The way I have set it up, I do. Let's see. I did have to make sure I got a computer that had 2 HDMI outputs, as well as a VGA for the monitor that I use. And right now I've got it really confusingly set up where I've got all 3 displays in front of me on my desk, showing the 2 rider displays as well as my own. But yes, one computer runs everything.
Okay. Oh, hang on. Sorry about that. Had some serious background noise for a minute. Let's see. We got another one just came in here. For easier assigning of sensors, why not have some material that reflects light back at the sensor in a certain way that is different from normal muscle, so the Moxy can output differently than normal to make it easier to see what sensor is attached to what output? That's a great idea. We've actually talked about some ideas that Drew has on that for how to get the sensors assigned. And if some of you are using the Wahoo software, the Wahoo software has a wand, so that after you get all the sensors attached, you can go around with this wand and use that. The wand will find the sensor that's closest to it. And that is to help solve that problem. But I think there's some other ways to do that. I know I've spoken with Drew on that, and he had some methods for helping with that exact issue. So I don't recall what they are right off the top of my head, but when I post this recording, I'll post that method that Drew had for helping to assign the sensor correctly.
That would be very, very nice.
There's something, he has a feature built into the Perf Pro software that's for that exact purpose. So I'll see what that is. Okay. Then we can go from there.
Cool.
Yeah, it's the the Wahoo wand uses the range functionality of ANT Plus, and that's correct. When you get the wand, it identifies which sensor is the closest, so you just hold it over the sensor. They use that for assigning power meters and cadence sensors and heart rate straps in their software.
Nice. Very nice.
So that's a feature that, or an issue that is common when you have a whole studio full of sensors.
Right.
Okay. Well, that's the end of our questions. If anybody has more questions, definitely we can follow this up in the forum. I'll post the recording in our online forum, and we can continue with any additional questions there. A big thank you to Curtis for sharing all this information. It's great to see that you're making this. You've got so many of these issues figured out, and you're really turning this into something productive. So nice work, and thank you for sharing it.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone.